Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Be peace and blessings upon you. Welcome to this session where we will be learning about the stories of Muslims within Guyana. And the title of the session is Uncovering Muslim Stories, which will be delivered by Ms. Ateeka Khan, which is part of her PhD submission to the McMaster University, Canada. Now, I would like to invite Professor Paloma Mohamed, our beloved Vice Chancellor, who has a PhD and is a full Professor of Behavior and Communication at University of Guyana. She is also an adjunct Professor of Cultural Diplomatics at Trent University. She is the current 11th Vice Chancellor and the first woman to lead the university in its 60th year history. She is also the first woman Vice Chancellor to be appointed in the Anglophone Caribbean. Before becoming Vice Chancellor, Professor Mohamed led the University Guyana's Transition Management Committee as its second chair from August 2019. She has been Deputy Vice Chancellor, Philanthropy, Alumni, Civil Engagement, known as SPACE, a department which she founded and built over the last 4 years. So I would welcome Professor Mohamed to give the opening remarks. Professor.
Good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. And I am very, very happy to be here this morning and to see my sister again, who I met a couple of months ago while there was an Islamic symposium hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the University of Guyana, and international Islamic organizations of high repute. They did manage to do a very beautiful event here on the campus for students with our own Islamic student club, and I was able to meet her. And so she has said that she had not been back to Guyana for over 23 years since that time, and now she's back again. So welcome. I'd also like to thank and pay respects to the elders for the Muslim community here this morning, and those who would have contacted the university to ensure that we had this opportunity for students and staff. I was telling Sister this just now that this event is clashing with another event that's happening, a research event a few doors away in another lab. But it's really important for us to be able to listen and welcome her work in the context of a couple of things. So the first thing is that it's important for those persons who are doing PhD work, especially on communities that are almost silent and silenced, such as our own Muslim communities in Guyana and in the Caribbean, so that work is reflected back to the communities that they're collected from. So as a way of validation, but also as a way of reflection and honoring the input of the communities that have supported the work. So that's the first thing. So I'm really happy that you've come back and you are sharing these stories with us. There are quite a number of people online. So you know how nowadays you have smaller audiences in the room and large audiences online. And then you also have the repeater audiences who didn't have a chance to view or to attend while the event was happening, but they can always go back over and over, excuse me, to revisit the publications or the presentations. So that's one of the beautiful possibilities of having things recorded and online so that other scholars can go to those stories, can plumb them for data, or also they know who to contact should they want to consider the conversation a little more. I myself have been very, in a certain sense, disconnected from that community. So even though my name is Mohamed, my father is Mohamed, so that's where I get the Mohamed from, with one M, not two. But that's a Guyanese Mohammed, not, once you see that, you know that's a Guyanese Mohammed. I'd like to also recognize Dr. Sita Mohammed Roth, who just walked in the room, and not a Guyanese Mohammed. But to get back to this, so I was given a book. Somebody sent me a book about a year and a half ago. I was very delighted to receive it. And I don't even know who sent the book because it showed up in my office. And my secretary said, a gentleman came and brought you this book. But I've been reading the book on and off, and it's a book on Muslim education in Guyana. Somebody has taken the time to actually document. It's one of the first, I think, documents that I have seen. I don't know, I cannot say that there are none, but it's one of the first documents that really looks at how Muslims were educated in Guyana over a long period of time. So that's a very, very important book. And it set me to thinking about where are the other accounts of Muslim life and contributions in this country and in the Caribbean. So when the symposium was held last year, and I really do think that one of the things that needs to come out of that are the publications of some of those presentations, because they were so very excellent. We also need to get them curated and put online, because some people don't like to read anymore. They like to see or listen, and that's okay too, but once people are able to interface with the information. Also, we're very lucky and privileged to have a very, very close relationship with Dr. Amina Ghafoor and Dr. Sattar Ghafoor, both of whom are very close to the university and close to me personally for years. Mostly Amina Ghafoor, because of the work that she has done in education and literature and in documenting the importance of not only the contributions of all writers and all educators, but 3 or 4 important works that she has produced. And I'd like to recognize Dr. Mark Tunbridge here, who has been collaborating with her for some time, editing the work that she has been doing. Some of the work, not all of it, but the major ones. But the one I want to talk a little bit about this morning is her memoir, which I'll be presenting. I happen to have a couple of copies in my office, and I asked my secretary to get a few, one for you and one for you. I heard you asking about it. It's a very fascinating book. Not only is Amina a beautiful writer, but she really captures in this book her own experiences as a Muslim woman. It's one of the first such works that I have seen emerge within the last 2 or 3 years, well, 4 years actually. And it's unfortunate that she's not well right now and is unable to continue her work, but she's left so much behind. She's alive, mind you, we're happy she's alive, but she's left so much in terms of what that voice and that eye and that experience was, that we're very, very thankful to her for that. So I see you as really continuing the work that has been started but generally left undone in this country. And so I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your work, for choosing to do that work, because I know you could choose to do anything as scholars. We really could. And I'm fairly sure that you would have had some obstacles in your way as well, many of them, but nothing good comes easy. So we want to thank you, to wish you well in your dissertation defense. I'm sure you will be able to pass with flying colors. And to thank everyone, Brother Wazir and all of those who would have helped to promote your work, to bring you back to us, and to all of you who I'm sure have other things to do this morning, but who have journeyed to come to listen to the presentation, and to those online. And Professor Ansari, thank you. I know you have a million things to do, but thank you for agreeing to be chair of the proceedings. Those of you who are not Muslim in the audience, this is not a Muslim event. This is an academic event, but it's about a particular topic that we would have been completely blindsided, or we'd have a blind side if the work of scholars like Azina, right? Ateeka, and others did not do. So thank you, God bless you, and I commend this to you. And if you see me walking out of here in about half an hour, it's because I have several other engagements back to back, everyone on the hour, so it's not a mark of disrespect to you. And this is the reason why I am really delighted that it is going to be online, so that I could switch to online even though I'm not in the room. And if I happen to have to get into another meeting, I can always listen to the rest later on today. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you, God bless you, and I know this is going to be wonderful. Thank you.
I would like to invite Professor to do the presentation of book before we proceed. Professor, you can.
Just because I might have to leave in the middle of I'm here only until 11, so I'd like to do these presentations now. So here is Amina Gafur's A Lantern in the Wind. I don't know, let me see if this is, yes, for you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Now we'll proceed with what we were waiting for. And thank you, Vice Chancellor, for your words. And I'm sure we need to know more about Guyana, about Muslims, about other communities, and the history of Guyana, in fact. And when I saw this feature, even I'm not aware of a lot of history within Guyana about different communities. So I congratulate Ms. Ateeka Khan for her work, which she has done. And just a brief background about her. She is a PhD student at McMaster University in Canada, where she examines the relationship between social, cultural, and political history of Muslim groups from the end of indentureship to the post-independence period of 1970s. She particularly focuses on documenting the various archival and oral stories that reflect how Muslims in the region contributed to shaping the post-independence period and beyond. So now I would like to invite Ms. Ateeka Khan to do her feature presentation uncovering Muslim stories, Muslims in the formation of 20th century Guyana. Ms. Ateeka Khan.
Thank you. Just gonna adjust here. Hi everyone, good morning. For our Muslim brothers and sisters in the room, Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be back in Guyana today and to share this work with you. As Dr. Mohamed just said, a lot of this research on communities like ours, and I say ours because I was born here. I know I haven't been here in many years. I came back in last September for the first time in 23 years, but it is really important to share this information back, to really validate it with all of you, get your perspectives, and recognize also that this history has not been well preserved. And so a lot of what I share will complement, stories that some of you online or in the room might have today. It's not meant to discount any of those lived stories or of other documented stories, but it's meant to really complement them so that we get a fuller picture of what this history looks like. So for that reason, I'm excited to share it with you today. I'm hoping it's a conversation. I know that we're structured like a lecture, and that's totally fine, but I do tend to I do tend to love engagement. I don't see myself as the expert in this. I think what I'm trying to do is document these stories so that our children can have them and future generations can have access to them. So with that, I'll get started. And I also wanted to thank the university, to thank Dr. Mohamed, Brother Wazir, and others who were involved in bringing this together today. I recognize it's not easy or simple. There are multiple and competing priorities, both at the university and outside of it. And so thank you to those who were able to organize this and for those of you who made it here today. Now, much of what I'm going to share with you are based on archival research that was done over the last 12 years to look at how Muslims in Guyana were shaped by the 20th century, but also shaped the 20th century and shaped post-colonial identities in Guyana, and the ways in which they either retained or preserved cultural practices or built new cultural practices in that 20th century. And so the first slide you see here is a picture of, this is actually my grandfather, not my dad and my son are here with me today, not my dad's parents, but my mom's dad, who was a teacher in Berbice at the time, was well known as Teacher Ali. But what this is meant, and this was him and his contemporaries, but what this is meant to share is these are their stories. These are the stories of our grandparents and our great-grandparents that we are passing on to our younger generation. And so I don't, as an expat, I don't know if I have claim to these stories as much as many of you who live here do, but I'm hoping that by bringing you into the conversation, we shape these stories going forward together. And so in the early 20th century, and some of you will be familiar with this context, about 45% of the population was South Asian. And of this population, approximately 50% identified as Muslim and 85% identified as Hindu. The remaining 55% of the broader population consisted of individuals who descended from the enslaved Africans and a small group of Portuguese, Chinese, and European populations, and a big number of mixed races at the time. So what you won't see in my presentation today, and it's really important to start here and to call back towards this, is the experiences of those enslaved Africans who settled in Guyana under significantly difficult circumstances and were colonized here in this country and brought with them, a number of them brought with them Islam. We don't know how many. We don't know to what degree. We only unfortunately have anecdotal evidences of this period, but it is an important context to start this conversation in. And so, unfortunately, some of the, this has been lost to time, but there are some really good scholars doing work in this field. Sylvain Diouf is looking at this work. How Reis's book on the 1835 rebellion in Brazil is another example. There is some work looking at Haiti, and whether Bookman, was Muslim or not, I think is still a matter of debate, but there are elements and practices there that also call back to potentially a Muslim heritage. So that is the beginning of this story, and one I won't be able to cover today, but I just wanted to start the conversation there to acknowledge that that's history, that it starts this story, and it isn't starting where I'm starting it, which is the 20th century. Now, if I can ask for the next slide. Oh, I think I can do this, actually. Maybe not. Okay. Okay. Oh, it's okay. I can do it. Thank you very much. So, all right. Apologies. I should have gotten that. I should have asked for that tutorial in advance. So, one of the, some of the early 20th century context that we're dealing with here was covered in a 1963 article that talked about the centenary. So it was celebrating 100 years of Muslim indentured immigrants in Guyana. And some of the things that this article talked about was, that Muslims who spread the faith in Guyana were identifiable amongst indentured laborers, particularly between 1853 to 1860. Now, and I recognize there's some, contention around where the first mosque is, or there might be a difference of opinion on that, and that's okay. What I'm looking at are what is the archival sources telling us? And so, I know I don't think we're in a position right now with limited sources to kind of debate which one is right and which one's wrong. But based on the, newspaper records and the archives, what we're seeing is references to the first mosque established in number 78 village, Berbice, under the care of Sohabat Sabrati, Ismail Sahabdin, Wajid Ali, and Qadmi, who were indentured immigrants from plantations, springlands. It also references, in 1963, 100 mosques with approximately a following of 60,000. And so this social context is important to consider, particularly for those of us who are familiar with what the 20th century looked like post-independence, pre-independence, but in a period where communities were trying to figure out what post-colonialism would look like for them. And in 1893, for example, there was a reference to 33 mosques and 33 temples and 29 mosques in Guyana. So you can see how much growth there was in the 60 plus years that followed. The ability of the Muslim community to find and access resources and organize themselves, both related to institutions such as places of worship, establishing places of worship, but also social structures, really stood out. And that's a lot of what I'll focus on today. It's really like, what are Muslims doing in the early 20th century? What sort of structures were they able to establish? Excuse me. And how were their communities able to cope with what was an incredibly challenging period in Guyanese history? It's not working for me. So at your convenience, if we can swap to the next slide, would be great. Thank you. So the theme of social services really continues throughout the 20th century. When Muslim organizations gathered for Eid, for example, such as Eid al-Adha, which is what you'll see in these, when it comes up, the next slide, they sacrificed animals as a part of the celebration of Eid al-Adha, but they offered a portion of these sacrifices to the community and then also distributed it to the poor. And what these articles are showing us is, and this is in 1918, they're showing us that in Queenstown, in Peters Hall, and likely in other parts of the country, Muslims were organizing themselves and starting to play a critical role in shaping organizations, shaping social services, and shaping the Muslim community in this early period. There's also a focus on the preservation of language. And so this is, for anyone who's looked at early 20th century papers, you'll see things in Urdu, or what they will sometimes refer to as Urdu Hindi, right? Because at the time, India and Pakistan hadn't quite separated, and the languages were considered to be quite similar. And so it's references Urdu Hindi, but there was a preservation of language in this early period that helped South Asians who had migrated to this colony at the time to be able to connect back to their languages. And so public notices, for example, were printed in Hindi or Urdu in addition to English. There was also attempts to negotiate with the political authorities, which is another running theme you'll see today. It's not about, how Muslims were shaped by this period, but how they also contributed into shaping this period, and how they interacted in the political regimes, how they interacted with legislation in order to shape that period. And I'm focusing on the Muslim community, but this is really the story of a lot of Caribbean countries where, and I don't know if there are other historians in the room, Catherine Hall's study of Jamaica does a really beautiful job of talking about how Baptists in Jamaica did a similar process of being shaped by the colony, but also shaping it, contributing directly. This wasn't a system that was just passed on to Guyanese folk, but it was also where they were participating in shaping the future that they wanted to see. So In 1939, and that was a tangent, but I'll get back to it. There were also attempts to negotiate with political authorities to get teachers who could help Indo-Guyanese to preserve these languages. So, for example, in 1939, Mohamed Sadiq of All Boys Town sent a memorandum to the West India Royal Commission, which is also known as the Moyne Commission, and they were at the time investigating the labor protests of the 1930s, asking to look into more teachers for Hindi Urdu in the country. And he claimed that the yearly allotted sum wasn't sufficient to teach the language here. Now, what's the significance of the preservation of language and its connection to Islam? Well, I won't get into tons of detail, but as we know, and linguists are saying this, we see this in our Indigenous communities in Canada, the preservation of language has a lot to do with the preservation of identity. And so one of the references that struck me is in 1939, for example, there was a gathering of what was termed the Muslim Ladies Association at the Rumveld Islamic School, and they were listening to a number of folks, Maulvi Muhammad Ali and others, and the editor talked about the fact that there was recitation of Quran, so Arabic, but also the singing of munajat, or songs, in Urdu or Hindi. Language was used and continues to be used to protect these stories. It's a great way to have oral traditions, and for those of you who are familiar with Islamic theology, a lot of our stories are meant to be passed down through what's called isnad. It's tradition. It's a story. There's a real systematic way of how we pass on oral stories. And so anyway, all that to say, the preservation of language made its way both into the legislations and the conversations we were having about legislations at the time, but also in social practices. They were also seen, Urdu was also seen in madrasas, and madrasas are I'm curious to read this book that Dr. Mohamed just gave me, because the evolution of education here is really curious. Madrasas were an important facet to the Islamic schools and the mosques that were established. It became a mechanism to really protect the stories of Muslims, but also to disseminate it to the younger populations. And so, for example, in 1945, there was a report that the Islamic Association of British Guyana met to discuss specifically a report that was produced at the time called the Examination and Inspection of Madrasas. And this work, and the article talks about how this work was carried out in the interest of the educational advancement amongst Muslim children. So this madrasa, or Muslim religious school, and these are schools that continue today, and I think many of you who live here can talk about the influence of some of these schools on Muslim communities. Now, if we can move to slide 4. Is it working now?
Yeah, so
okay.
Oh,
got it. Thank you. I was pointing it in the wrong place. Thank you. Now, while I'm trying to paint a story for you of Muslims in the early 20th century through archival sources, I did want to note 2 things. These are sources from newspapers and official documents, so they will not reflect a full experience of life in this country, both Muslim life, but also any experiences in general in this country. And I think, many of us can mull over the fact that a lot of these documents are unfortunately colonial documents. And so there's a real history there with the way that the documents were written. The newspapers were written from particular lenses. So there are gaps in the materials I'm presenting. And so if you look at the slides, especially some of the future slides, just bear that in mind, that these are going to be heavily slanted based on who was writing and the purposes for writing that at the time. There were also heavily fragmented social dynamics, and this is what this slide highlights. It's not possible to talk about 20th century Guyana without talking about those heavy social fragmentations, or at least we could, but we'd be making up a story, in my opinion. We would be really glossing over some of the significant pieces of this history. And so while I won't get into that today, I wanted to highlight that because one of the concerns of the colonial government at the time was to see unity amongst the Guyanese groups. And so social fragmentation became a mechanism to really control the population. By keeping the population separate, colonial authorities were able to maintain their control over the population. And so you see this playing out a lot in the 20th century, and I think this will be no surprise to many of you in the room. So I just wanted to highlight that because these materials I'm sharing have to be approached with that caution. We can't, you know. Thank you. So as Muslims began to participate in social spaces in more significant ways and to organize their communities around village mosques, they also began to play a role in the development of political artifacts, legislations, ordinances, etc., and to ensure that Muslim perspectives were reflected in these. So for example, what was previously known as the heathen marriage ordinance, it's got a number of names over the late 19th century and early 20th century. It was later known as the marriage of Asiatics, I think in the 1920s. In the 1940s, it was called the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Ordinance. It was called Muslim, but Hindu groups also participated in negotiating this ordinance. So there are aspects to this that I write about. I won't be able to cover all of it today. But what I really wanted to talk about was the process of negotiating this legislation. The fact that communities asserted themselves in the negotiation of this legislation, took a position on the shaping of this legislation, and advocated for what they saw was their perspectives and their religious needs in it. And so I wanted to highlight that because I think a lot of us get hung up on, you know, what's the fact, what was the outcome, and that's important. But the actual process of negotiation, I think, teaches us a lot about our history. And so what we saw here, and you see it on this slide, is the development of differences of opinion between Muslim groups, which, I mean, that's the nature of the maturity of communities. And so, for example, on the petition on the right of the screen, and there were many of these, they're filed in the National Archives in the UK, and they have each one, they still have each one. I don't know if the archives here has a copy, but it's very interesting because what communities did was they petitioned, this was, these were signed by representatives of the, what was called the Anjuman Mufid al-Islam, who requested their own representation in the Indian Advisory Committee because they had differences of opinion with the other Muslim organization at the time, the Sadr Anjuman. And so they signed a whole bunch of these petitions in 1951 to request that the Secretary of State for the colonies give them representation in addition to the Sadr Anjuman, who they didn't think were representing the interests of the Muslim community sufficiently well. And so what you see is these petitions were all signed by Muslim communities across the country, from Alexander Village and Kitty to more distant places like Iflut, Rose Hall, Skeldon. And so while the Colonial Office didn't respond positively to the receipt of these petitions, they did create a subcommittee to the Advisory Committee of Indian Affairs in order to respond to these requests. And so what you see is Muslim groups starting to navigate the bureaucracy, starting to play a role in shaping that bureaucracy and starting to advocate for their perspectives. So as we get into the 1960s, and you know, this is the period of pre and post-independence, there's a lot happening in Guyana in the 60s. It was a really interesting period of social, political, and religious development as a result, and significant for Muslims in this country for a number of reasons. And there are going to be additional reasons. I just, you know, distilled it to a few key points to make it manageable to present this in an hour as opposed to keeping you all here all day. The first key sort of significant milestone in the 60s was that this had marked what the community here saw as the centenary, 100 years of Muslims in this country. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we can question, you know, the starting point of that 100 years, given that we know that enslaved Africans brought Islam to this country as well. But for the purposes of the remembered history and nostalgia at the time, they saw the 1960s as the mark of 100 years of presence in this country. And so what occurred as a result of that is heads of government and commercial organizations then gathered at number 78 Village in quarantine what the newspapers describe as to celebrate with pomp and pride, with ceremonial and religious observances, this centenary of Islam in Guyana. And so it became a moment where, political organizations as well as religious organizations came together to mark this time. And that becomes an increasing trend, the relationship between Muslim groups and later political organizations, and perhaps some earlier ones as well. The second point here is that religious individuals often became involved in political organizations. It was a very interesting trend where you saw individuals who, were leading temples or mosques, etc., or organizations, then become absorbed into the political fabric of the country. And it's very curious because you'll hear things like, well, it's not, faith isn't meant to be political, but often you see these important faith contributors then participating heavily in shaping in participating in political organizations at the time. What you also see is, for example, the Sadr Anjuman, which was a very large Muslim organization here. One would argue perhaps the most significant in this period, although that changes. So this particular organization was impacted by politics that was playing out in the country, and so you see the dynamic of Muslims being influenced by the political nature of the country at the time, and their organizations being impacted as a result. And so this organization then split into two groups at the time, one group supporting the PPP and one group supporting the PNC. There was also close interaction between Muslim organizations and other groups. So for example, the president of the Sadr Anjuman, Abdul, became the chairman of the United Force. There were political schisms that followed as a result of that, and some questions from the organizations themselves about the nature of that relationship. And thirdly, there was the formation of the Guyana United Muslim Party. Now, we know historically that this party had minimal impact on the evolution of politics in the 20th century. But what it does demonstrate for us looking back is that continued assertion of Muslim needs and rights expressed through politics. There was a number of interesting discussions that occurred between political leaders at the time about how to ensure Muslims voted for the Guyana United Muslim Party so that we could separate votes, for example, from other larger political parties to ensure that those parties didn't receive the Muslim votes. It's very curious. These records are at the Commonwealth Library in the UK. It's very interesting to look at. Now, I'm going to just try and move to the next slide. So these few slides, and I'll cover slides 7 and 8 sort of briefly, is intended to highlight the relationship between political figures at the time and Muslims in the country. And naturally there was a need, and I don't think this was specific to Muslim groups, but there was an attempt to curry favor amongst Muslims. And so you see that playing out through political conversations at the time. And then a lot of tense interactions and criticisms, right, that were launched on both sides as a result of those interactions. And so you see that on the records I have on 7 and 8. But what I wanted to move on to was slide 9, because these interactions are, interesting. But what I'm really curious about is how the community then moves forward. And some of the ways in which the community then moves forward is this example you see in front of you. So in response to concerns about whether independence representatives could sufficiently reflect the interests of Muslims, a motion was passed to send a delegation of Muslims to the Independence Conference in London in October of 1862 for the purposes of, and this is quoting from the newspaper article, for the purposes of getting guarantees for the religious, social, and economic independence of Muslims in Guyana. Not only that, but it was proposed to be attended by members of the United Sadr Anjuman, the Muslim League, and the Ahmadiyya movement. So this conference is demonstrating that determination to what they called to struggle continuously for the defense of Islam. But what was interesting to me looking back is that multiple religious groups had gotten together to advocate in this way. Now, it doesn't tell us if those groups actually went to the Independence Conference, but the fact that they were demanding representation, I think, is very, very, it shows us a lot of how groups were advocating in the country as independence began to take shape. We also, we also saw the use of newspapers to teach Muslims in the country about their religion. And so I'm just going to pause here on this slide. There was this slide just highlights growing infrastructure. It is not any surprise, we talked about it at the beginning, but one of the ways in which Muslims organized themselves were around mosques. And so as a result, in the 60s, you see a lot of mosques popping up around the country in order to create that hub for social services, for worship, for education, madrasas, etc. And we can see the impact of those mosques today. Just driving around, we were in the West Coast, just driving around, you see ambulances outside of mosques. You see the kind of social services that are still embedded within the fabric of the mosques here today. We also see the use of newspapers to teach Muslims in the country about their religion. And I'm highlighting this particular Indo-Guyanese imam here, Imam Bacchus, or Mulvi Imam Bacchus as he's referred to. But elsewhere I write about a similar speaker, an Afro-Guyanese individual who was writing stories at the same time named Malik Shabazz, also in the 1960s. I just couldn't cover everything today. But I want to make reference to that because I think it's important to know that this was happening in, Guyanese stories are often told from an Indo-Guyanese or an Afro-Guyanese perspective. And by telling it from a Muslim perspective, it really distorts that separation. And so it is really important to highlight that these things were happening in communities and individuals across the country were doing these things in different ways. And so this particular imam, Imam Bacchus, he was writing in Berbice, and he wrote a whole bunch of treatises over the 1960s. There are so many. He taught Muslims how to fast, how to pray, what death looked like, all of the basics of worship were distilled in these very short newspaper articles in the Berbice Times over the 1960s. He provided an overview of the funeral prayer. He wrote this treatise about Ramadan that I have on the left just because Ramadan was recent and I thought that one made sense. But there's a lot that he covered. He talked about commandments for fasting, exceptions to this rule, moral values of discipline, blessings, forgiveness, etc. And so he went into a great amount of detail in providing this information to the community through these newspaper articles. At the same time, I think we can't discount the social life that was occurring, right? A lot of our social practices are informed by things like religion. And so this slide highlights a bit of that, the significance of food in bringing people together, in identifying, what can Muslims eat? Can they have, can they have golden cream? I was looking for the name. Can they have golden cream? It talks about Muslim weddings occurring at that time, which for us who just looked at the Muslim marriage and divorce ordinance, it's really important to note that then Muslim marriages became legitimate. You could get married according to the Muslim faith and have that be documented as legal. And so just wanted to highlight that as we get to the end. And so at this very last stage, and if I can ask to get to the YouTube link, sorry, as soon as you get up, I have to ask for something. Please and thank you. We're going to put on a YouTube link, but as we get the link on, I wanted to pause on this slide. So the 1980s is often seen as a rebirth of Islam in the country, etc. And a lot of this story is attributed to a missionary named Ahmed Ibrahim Ihwaz. And so he was the Libyan charge d'affaires in the country at the time. He was emissary to places like Denmark, Yemen, Somalia, Malaysia, and Guyana last. And he's described as the founder and commander of the rescue forces, the GIA military wing, in Libya. And his presence in Guyana was intended to be an extension of Libyan foreign policy, focusing on pan-Arabism alongside the socialist Islamist focus of the Gaddafi regime. And so what we know of Ihwaz, and I wanted to highlight this for a number of reasons, and I'll get into that. What we know of him is that he established a series of programs in Guyana that changed East Indian cultural religious practices of the Muslims in the country that dominated prior to the 80s into a more orthodox approach to Islam that spread across the country. And I'm going to play a few thoughts here of someone named Sheikh Moeen, some of you might be familiar with. But what I'm playing this from is a recent repository of stories of recordings that was done by a number of folks, Nazim Baksh and a few others. But they really, what they're trying to do is document the stories of individuals who experienced life in Guyana at the time of Ahmed Ihwaz and were influenced by him. So it's very much circling around this individual because of the important role that he played in shaping what we see as modern day Islam in Guyana. But what the other thing I wanted to highlight is the importance of oral stories. So you'll see, for example, this particular reflection is very different from the archival records I shared with you, which, is it ready? Because I can pause here. Okay, I'm going to pause here and let it play.
How did he create a foreigner, an Arab, an ambassador in a land which does not speak Arabic, and to create that amount of, or leave such an indelible impression on the country is undoubtedly a great gift from Allah, and his connection with his spiritual connection with Allah and his Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this is evidenced in his simplicity, his humility, his honesty. Yeah. I can only, and I made this statement at one of the presentations of the Guyana Islamic Trust, in one of their Islamic awareness programs several years ago, when I spoke on two personalities. One was Sheikh Ahmed Ihwaz, and the second was Brother Azam Mohamed. But I spoke more about Ahmed Ihwaz, and I summarized his life, his work, in a statement of the Holy Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when he said, the life you live, it will determine not the exact meaning, but it will also determine your khitam, your ending. And so, in one of my Hajj several years ago, leading the Guyana group, on that morning, on the day of Arafah, moving from Mina to Arafat, with the Guyana and American group. And there was an Arab who came on the bus with us. And we spoke. Then I come to know that he was a Libyan living in a European country. And he asked me, do you know about Libya? I said, of course, I know about Libya. He says, well, who do you know? I said, I know Ahmed Ihwaz. He says, oh yeah? And he looked at me and he made a statement in Arabic. In fact, he made two statements. He said, Huma Rijal. He said, these were the men. But of course, those of us who know Arabic will know when it is used in that context, it does not only refer to an ordinary man. When the Arab says, Huma Rijal, with that emphasis, they're speaking about men of a certain caliber. And he says, yeah, those were men. We're talking about the movers and the shakers. And then the second statement, and that struck me, and it emphasizes the individual and his acceptance in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, it is not a coincidence that the two of us remember him today on this most blessed day of the year and the most important day in the Islamic year, the day of Arafah. That he says it's not a coincidence. I said, you're right. It's not a coincidence. And that we must remember him in our prayers on this blessed day. And that Allah grant him Jannatul Firdaus and all those who follow in his footsteps. And so he has left undoubtedly a rich legacy of Islamic spirituality and Islamic maturity. And I think may be something that is lacking among some of the Islamic personalities of these times. A person can come and have such a great impact, not only on the Muslim but the non-Muslim community of Guyana, the Caribbean, and wider countries, even in North America, in such a short time. It is worthwhile seeking to understand how did this happen. And in my humble opinion, it happened by the permission of Allah and because of his dedication, commitment, and connection with Allah and his Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
So this was one of the videos. I think the one that I was hoping to highlight is also where Sheikh Moeen talks about the state of Islam just prior to when Ahmed was arrived and the influence he had in Guyana at the time. And he makes the argument that the practice of Islam became somewhat dormant, and we can discuss what that means in the context of the different ways we talked about today, where Islam was preserved. There are many of me speaking. It's like my child's worst nightmare. 15 voices, mom. Okay. Where Islam was preserved through language, it was preserved through social practices, it was preserved through social services, etc. But the other thing I wanted to highlight for folks, and I was saying this just before the video started, was the importance of documenting these oral stories. And so for any of you who are teaching history classes, those of us who are teaching these classes see this as a repository for these stories so that our students can go into it and make meaning of it, so that I, as an individual, isn't telling you what meaning you should make out of these stories, but that future students can. So take a look at this online archive. It is a really great resource. And it really helps to take the stories, the history of our Muslim communities, but also the history of Guyana in general, outside of the colonial archives. And those of us who lived it start to make meaning of these and start to share these stories instead. And so by way of conclusion, I wanted to just, share a couple of things. So as you saw, I tried to take you through a bit of a journey of what I found through the archives over the 20th century, the stories of Muslims in this country, both through legislation, through social services, through other practices, and then in the 80s, as different organizations get established that create what we see as Islam in Guyana today, or the context for that. Of course, it's changed since. It was also clear that Muslim groups didn't shy away from the political domain, but seemed to see themselves as guardians of the local population and advocated as such. they negotiated what we later came to term as nationalism. They participated in shaping nationalistic concepts. They advocated for workers, demanded representation, fair rights. They were very vocal about speaking out against colonial authorities. And it leaves us with a couple of lessons, at least a couple I'll highlight today, but all of you will have you'll have to make your own meaning of this. But some of the lessons that stuck out to me, and I said this one a little bit earlier, and I think it's important to repeat it. When we speak of Guyanese history, we often view it in this bifurcated way. And I think when we take that story outside of, the Indo-Guyanese history, the Afro-Guyanese history, and into different lenses, in this case, the Muslim history of the country, we see a different story. And I think it's a story that offers the kind of dynamic that Guyana is moving towards, or at least as an observer, as the Guyana I'm observing in my travels here, where we are trying to move towards a more harmonized future where communities are less. These stories are not going to go away. These are awful stories that we have to grapple with, and they do come with us, right? But they offer us possibilities that are different. We also need to assess the precedent here, and this is not a political speech. I'm not interested in making a political speech, but we need to look at the history of Guyana and how that paved the way for our current dynamics. We have a president who identifies as Muslim, etc. There's a history here that paves that way, and so we need to unpack that history and look at how that history came to bear. And then finally, the reclamation of stories. These are stories that are in our archives. These are the documented stories we have to grapple with. So we need to take a careful look at these stories and reflect them back, but also really interrogate them and assess whether what that means for our histories and how we make meaning of that story going forward. And so, I'll leave you with this is the process of decolonizing history. It's not easy, it's complicated, it's messy, it's often thorny. We have to grapple with stories that, we see in a newspaper that likely, if, we lived that time, somebody would say, well, that was nonsense. I wouldn't read that. And that's just reality, right? And so these are the stories we've got documented. So we've got to think about how we document our stories going forward so that they're more holistic, so they do tell a broader range they give a broader range of understanding of this context for future children, but also to grapple with these very challenging narratives that we have to look at and unpack them further. So I think that's it from me. I'm happy to have a conversation or answer questions if there is time, but thank you so much for joining me today and for listening to what I have to share. Thanks. I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ateeka Khan. It was really enlightening to know a lot of these facts. And I was also looking forward to know about these stories. And all these stories of past are not forgotten, and they also help us to shape the future of different communities as well. So once again, thank you, and wish you all the best towards your completion of your PhD. It's a lot of work, enormous work, and I am sure people will continue in this direction to explore more of what has been within the history of Guyana and within the Caribbean. So once again, thank you very much. And now I would like to invite questions from the audience, online as well as who are physically present here. So the floor is open for the questions from Ms. Ateeka. Please go ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned about Bacchus and Berbice, but living in Guyana and originally from Berbice, I would like to know which part of Berbice. I was thinking I know a Bacchus in Shitanka. Was there?
I think at one point it made reference to quarantine, but the thing is, he wrote for the Berbice Times, but it doesn't have a lot of biographical information about him. And I tried to go back to the very first article that they wrote in the 60s, just to see if they started with, introducing this new author. But it wasn't the nature of writing at the time. And so he was just introduced as Mulvi, Imam Bacchus, but he was a prolific writer. And, I did a number of oral interviews, and no one I've asked, including people from Berbice, know who this person is. So it's interesting that this was getting into the public regularly, but no one knew who he was.
Because I know him.
You know him? Okay, we'll talk after.
I knew him. He passed away now. So.
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk after then.
Yeah.
Other questions?
There he was Abu.
Yeah. You mentioned the mosque in Berbice. I can't recall you mentioning the mosque in Queenstown, Esquibo. And that, I think, is reported to have been built in the late 1700s by the slaves, the Fulani slaves, Fulani Muslim slaves.
Yeah. And those are the histories that we, in these resources, we don't see documented. Those are exactly the details we need to document. But the challenge for us is the authenticity of these sources, right? And that's exciting, like that's great to hear. And I know there was one in the West Coast that is alleged to also have been the first mosque, but the documentation of that history is mostly through oral stories, and those are sometimes harder to assess the authenticity of. But thank you. That's important.
I think there's a plaque there somewhere, a very old plaque on the site.
Yeah.
Because I think even though the mosque was rebuilt, the original mosque, the site of the original mosque has not quite disappeared. So that's one. My second question, the Taja Festival, in your research, did you find any reference to the Taja Festival when it was being enacted, don't want to use the word celebrated, when it was enacted in the 1800s, and I'm trying to find the most recent enactment, and that was on the estates. I can't find the literature on that. Were you able to see anything about the Taja Festival?
Yeah, I've seen some. Frank Curran from Boston University, I think if you've been looking into this, you probably encountered his research on Trinidad, not Guyana. In the 1920s, I think it might have been 1927, I did find some materials that referenced the Tajda Festival. They were negotiating for the festival to continue, and the colonial authorities at the time said no because they hadn't applied for that permission early enough in advance for the festival to continue. And so, it seemed, the way it was reported in the newspaper, it seemed like it was a previously unknown requirement. And it might have been, like, I don't know, one of the things that I've written about this one of the things that I've asked is whether this was made up at the time to stop the Tajda Festival, because it was a celebration. It was often bringing people of multiple ethnicities and faith groups together. And so I wasn't sure, and you can't tell from the newspaper articles, but it seemed like they were making it difficult to celebrate that year. So it was starting to create, legislative changes that would really slow down the celebration of Tajda or make it, or cancel it as it did that year.
Yeah, that year we have on that year, but I meant in the 1800s and after the 1920s, because it did continue on the estates.
Yeah.
So you have oral history on that. We even have some photographs that were made into postcards on the estates because of the stick fighting getting out of control. It was stopped in the 20s, the official one on the roads. So you haven't found any other besides the 1920s.
No,
Thank you very much.
Not in the 60s, certainly. It could have, and I've looked at the 20s, the 40s, and the 60s, but obviously I didn't look at every single newspaper. It would be really challenging to do that, although AI might help us with that now. But yes, not that I've seen after that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Not to you, but just to respond to those two. The first one at the mosque, which is the forest mosque. We just need to understand Muslim and mosque. We have structures, physical structures, but we pray anywhere on earth. So we don't have to have a physical structure to pray. So the early indentured servants, because of the nature of plantation life, they have to work for 12 hours. If you know the history, and I'm from a history background. And then later on, through interventions, when it reduced to 8 hours, but was 12 hours. So it was difficult for them to establish a 5 daily prayers as we establish it now. So what they will do in the month of Ramadan, where they were living what we call the lodges, right out, they will organize themselves in open air to pray. Particularly the late night prayer, what we call the Isha prayer, and the Taraweeh prayer. Not so much the other prayers. And so from 1838, when Muslims came here, they will organize their life. What we know of the physical structure, that is the difference. Was it in Philadelphia in East Essequibo, or was it in Berbice? The historical documents that are showing, number 78, it seems, was the first masjid in 1863. The other thing about the first masjid at Queenstown, as they claim, I believe is more sensational rather than a fact. Because if we study slavery, nobody was allowed to practice any religion except Christianity. This is the documented sources, all the documented sources. So how come the colonial powers then, the slave masters, would allow slaves to build a masjid in Queenstown, Essequibo? That's problematic. So I don't believe any masjid was built. What we know from some of the writings, Muslims practice their religion secretly. Even here, you will hear they will pray in the late night and the early morning. Muslim pray, if you know the structures, we pray in the early morning, late night, but no references mentioning to Muslim prayers. The other thing is, an emancipation date was a Friday, and where the public building is, Parliament building was, the slaves celebrated with Friday midday prayers. This is in document. And the only people who perform Friday midday prayers are the Muslims. So, but we don't know what happened after. Those are the things we are trying to find out what happened after. So I just want to mention that in respect to the Tazia, or the Taja, what you call it, Muslims made representation to man it, because it was often taken by J.B. Singh, and he was a distributor for alcoholic beverages. He was in Lamaha Street, and he took over the celebration, and he used to put it not in Muharram, but out of crop season, when the workers would be at home, they'd not be working in the field. Because if you get it in Muharram, which is a lunar calendar, it might fall during the time of crop time, so they will not have people to celebrate. People just use it out, not for a religious term, but drinking and sporting and what have you. Everybody is participating in that. So the Islamic Association of Guyana, those are the things that give birth to the Islamic Association of Guyana, because when the Muslims want to protest, they were advised they have to be an organized, registered body to protest and make representation. So they formed the Islamic Association in the 1930s. And the Islamic Association, then I get this information orally because I interviewed people. representation, and the colonial people, they ban it. Not anybody else, not because they recognize that the South is not religiously bent, and then all this rum drinking and sporting and dancing up, it's against our belief. It's not festivals or carnival. It's religious. So that ban. And in Trinidad, they get the Tazia celebration right now, Hussein, but it's all fun and frolic, right? It's not religious the way how we know it.
We have a question from Dwayne Benjamin, a participant online. And Dwayne says, thank you very much for this presentation. Your presentation has highlighted what I might call a gray area in Guyanese historiography, that is Muslim history. And you have done an excellent job of bringing the issue of Muslim contribution to Guyana's social and cultural landscape to life. His first question is, what was the reaction of other groups to Muslims asserting their identity and culture during the period of your study? So I'll ask that, allow you to respond, and then I'll ask the second question.
Yeah.
And that is, what was the reaction of other groups to Muslims asserting their identity and culture during the period of your study?
Thank you, and thanks for your kind words. The reaction of other Muslim groups is a complex question only because this was a period where Muslims were diversifying in their perspectives. There were more organizations popping up as soon as there was a gap or a need, as Brother Wazir just highlighted. An organization would kind of pop up to meet that need. And then what you had where there was, the Sadr Anjuman was a very large organization. There were large organizations that were sort of driving things for the most part, but other smaller organizations that were starting to express their perspectives. And so the marriage and divorce ordinance, for example, that I highlighted earlier, is an example where you see disconnect between Muslim organizations that had perspectives about the marriage and divorce ordinances. And so with regard to the second question, it's really interesting, at least the pieces that I looked at, and of course there are, as I mentioned earlier, multiple narratives here, but in the case of the marriage ordinances, Hindu and Muslim groups worked together. So when the Muslims were writing into the colonial authorities to say, like, we need this, that, and the other from the Muslim marriage ordinance, from this bill, Hindu groups were saying, we also need this, that, and the other. So they jumped on that, and it's not referred to in the records as, and it's very interesting, it's called the Muslim marriage ordinances, because when you start to sift through the records, you find those letters from temples and from Hindu organizations saying, we also need this. Like, if you're going to start to look at non-Christian ways of recognizing marriages, think about us too. We are a large community here. Yep.
His second question is, was this movement confined only to Demerara and Berbice? What about Essequibo?
Yeah, you know what, and the question earlier, I really appreciated around the history of enslavement in Essequibo. I don't have enough records to speak to Essequibo. It's a huge gap. If others are doing this work, I would love to see it, right? A lot of the newspapers were being circulated across the country, but they were primarily centered in Demerara and Berbice. And so as the question was being asked earlier, I was mulling over, like, that to me seems like an area for future research where we really need to understand the history that was referenced in Essequibo, but also other stories. And we know anecdotally that Essequibo was a rich area, right? In the 80s, people like my dad and others were going to Essequibo and teaching Islamic classes out there. But what that history looks like prior to the 80s is, I think, going to take some work to unpack.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Are there any other questions? Probably we'll take the last one. Thank you very much, Ms. Ateeka Khan, for your enlightening talk as well as the conversation that we had. And I'm sure we all benefited, and in time to come, hopefully we should concentrate more on the history of Guyana in terms of the cultural exchanges, the religion within the Guyana, and how it has shaped, and what is the correlation with indentureship, and how it has shaped Guyana where we are today. So once again, thank you very much. And at this point of time, I would like to invite Ms. Kathleen Reid, who is an instructor in the Language Center, Department of Language and Cultural Studies, Faculty of Education and Humanities, to do the vote of thanks. What happened?
There is just one more question before we go to Ms. Reid. And this participant said that you mentioned your father taught in Essequibo. Where did he come to teach in Essequibo, and what was the number like back then? Just to get a bit on how the community would have grown over time. Where in Essequibo, and what was the number like, and how the community would have grown over time?
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. And I want to tell you one secret is that microphones are problematic all over the world. I was initially in Essequibo from late 1977, 78, and I spent a number of years there, maybe 10 years. It was with the revival of our teacher, Sheikh Ahmad Awaz. The people in Essequibo, I could talk for an hour on the people of Essequibo, but the people of Essequibo are very warm-hearted people. I was able to, they were very simple in their lives. I found that Essequibo, the Muslims were small in numbers, but because of their interest in the different masjids that you have, they already had what you call some cultural things that they were doing. They had ladies' organization, they had the madrasa system, and they were small in numbers, but they were very energetic in their work. And the people of Essequibo embrace each other, whether you're from whatever, you might be a Christian or you might be Hindus, but they move across the borders. There were people who will assist each other in the transportation for various religious function, whether they were Muslims or not. So they were small in numbers, but they were people who were very loving, and they made so many progress in their work. When I went there, the simple act of the performance of a prayer was difficult for the youths. And they were willing to learn. And you'll be surprised at the stories. Ladies will take their benches, old ladies in their 60s, will step up onto a big truck with benches to move to another part of Essequibo in order to learn their Islam. These are sacrifices. Boat was a normal function. You can imagine going to the Pomeroon River and you invited people for a lecture, and they'll be coming paddling with their boats and tied to the masjid. Beautiful experience. You can never relive it, inshallah. So I thank you very much, but I want to tell the gentleman online that the people of Essequibo might have been small in numbers in those days, but they had their Islam. And in every village, they had their church and they had their temples. But the corporation, they move above organization. There was in the country had a difference between the different organization. In Essequibo, they rise above organization. And I always say it's because of their warm heart. I've spoken enough. Thank you very much.
And we have one other question from the audience. It seems that they're now getting activated.
Hello. Excuse me. I've listened. I was quite late for this, whatever how was happening. But since when I know you're a Muslim, I have been for the last few weeks. I've been studying both the Muslim and the Christian field, and I would like to answer two questions. Number one, why do women wear hijabs and not men? And number two, why do women cover their faces when they pray? So my mother covered her face with a sheet when she was going to pray, and I covered the sheet with my face, and she said, no, men don't do that. And another thing as well is the Christian field, is a biblical aspect to the Christianity and the Quran, is it the same thing? Is it similar?
I really appreciate your questions. I will say I'm an academic, so like I enjoy studying the history of Islam, but I would never claim to be a scholar of the faith. I don't have any claims to that. So what I might say is I think your questions are very important. Maybe I'll direct you to some folks after who can help to answer those questions in a faith-based way. I think your first question mentioned, why do women wear hijab? I would say some women, right? There are Muslim women who don't wear hijab, and some women do, some wear the niqab. There are social contexts, political contexts, sometimes depending on where you are in the world. And there are religious, reasons why women choose to wear hijab, and those are certainly mine. But I wouldn't want to give you an answer right now from a faith-based perspective, because I think it's very important to separate our scholars of faith from our academic scholars and our researchers, and that's certainly not my area of expertise. So I'll connect you with a few folks afterwards, and I'll make sure that somebody is able to answer your question. The one thing I'll highlight, though, with regard to Christianity and Islam, and coming back to my research, is a lot of these trends were occurring amongst Muslim groups in Guyana at the time, but they weren't different from what was occurring in Christian groups, right? The Canadian Presbyterian Archives has a ton of materials that show us how Christianity in the country went through a process of what they called indigenization in the records, and that's where Guyanese who had converted to the faith had decided that, I wasn't going to let the faith be directed by Christians outside of country, and so they reshaped it to have more meaning for local Guyanese. To your other pieces, I think we can chat after, and I'll try and make sure you get connected to the right folks to answer you. Thank you. Is that it? Are we done with questions?
Finished.
Okay, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to invite Ms. Kathleen Reid to the vote of thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for being here. This morning's presentation has been quite insightful and impactful. And we're living in an environment in Guyana where there are so many stories being told to our young people and so many stories being told to our children. And I think it's very important that these stories are told so that our generations that are now coming up, they can have a different insight, a different outlook, and they can understand that although we are different, all of us are important in the fabric of Guyana. So, Ms. Khan, we thank you so very much for your presentation. We thank you for, thank you. We thank you for choosing Guyana, right? The Vice Chancellor did say this at the beginning, but I would like to emphasize it. We thank you for choosing to come here and to share your research and to open conversations in these areas, right? And you have re-emphasized that representation matters and all of our stories matter, so we thank you for that. I would like to recognize Mr. Bash. Thank you for being here. Professor Ansari. I would like to recognize Dr. Tombridge, Professor Dr. Sita Sharo, and I would also like to acknowledge Mrs. Jillian Williams. Thank you so much for being here. To our viewers online, thank you for the questions that you have asked. To our audience here, thank you for all the questions and all the discussions that we've had. I know we've had an engaging session here. And again, thank you so very much. I wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. The program comes to end, but not before I request you to join for light refreshment. Please proceed. Thank you very much.